There's a kind of exhaustion that no doctor can diagnose and no medication can cure. A weariness that doesn't come from the body, but settles deep within the soul of those who are constantly trying to earn their place in the world. It's the fatigue of someone who can't sit down without guilt, of someone who even during rest feels like they owe something, someone who only relaxes after fulfilling some obligation, delivering some form of productivity, justifying their existence through results. It's the fatigue of someone who never feels free to simply exist, because they've learned that worth is always tied to some form of utility, and when the body asks for rest, the mind screams with guilt. You haven't done enough today. There's so much left to do. You're being weak. These silent voices become routine, until even sleeping turns into an internal battle. This invisible pressure becomes so constant that over time the person doesn't even notice it anymore. They wake up already thinking about what needs to be delivered. They begin the day with the feeling that they're behind on their own life, and even when everything is up to date, even when there's no urgent deadline, the chest still feels tight, because the problem isn't the to-do list, it's the deep-rooted belief that if you're not being useful, then you're a burden. It's as if we've internalized the idea that resting is a moral failure, and this pressure doesn't come only from the workplace. It's at home in casual conversations, in compliments that always praise those who do a lot, who achieve a lot, who never stop. It's in the phrases we've heard since childhood. An idle mind is the devil's workshop. Those who sleep too much won't get far. If you don't work, you don't deserve it. We grow up believing that we're only worthy if we're delivering results, as if our very existence were a lifelong debt that can only be paid with effort. The cruelest part is that this exhaustion doesn't explode all at once. It accumulates in silence, in sleepless nights, in Sundays filled with a heavy chest, in holidays turned into productive days just to get ahead, in moments of leisure that carry guilt, as if we're allowing ourselves something we haven't earned. Rest becomes an unreachable reward, never a legitimate right, and the body, loyal servant to the soul, begins to scream. Frequent headaches, tight shoulders, irritated stomach, constant fatigue. The body starts saying what the mind refuses to hear, that maybe the problem isn't lack of time, but lack of internal permission to stop. That maybe the body is tired of being treated only as a productivity machine. But behind this demand, there's a deeper emotional wound. The fear of not being loved if you're not being useful. The anxiety of being disposable. The shame of not producing, not delivering, not having something to show. The truth is, many people don't know who they are without what they do. They can't see themselves as valuable unless they're busy. And this is not weakness. It's a symptom of a culture that turned productivity into identity. A society that convinces you that if you're not doing something all the time, you're wasting your life. But what if it's the opposite? What if the real waste is living only to produce, never allowing yourself to simply be? You're not tired because you're lazy. You're tired because you've been living as if you constantly have to justify your own existence. And no one can carry that weight alone for long. It's not weakness, it's humanity. The exhaustion you feel isn't a sign of failure. It's a cry for help. A cry for you to slowly start allowing yourself to rest, without guilt, without fear, without needing to prove anything to anyone. Because your worth is not in what you do. It's in who you are, even when you're doing nothing. There is an invisible, sneaky idea that infiltrates our beliefs from an early age, that only what serves a purpose has value. And once this logic settles into our minds, it begins to contaminate everything. Our relationships, the way we rest, and even our very way of existing. Suddenly, we start believing that even our bodies must be functioning all the time to be worth something. If it's not producing, serving, delivering, then it's not justifying its presence. It's as if we're constantly being audited for our existence. And this demand doesn't need to be spoken aloud. It lives in glances, in silence, in comparisons, in invisible goals we don't even know who created, but still make us run non-stop. The "if it's not useful, it's worthless" syndrome is cruel, because it turns everything into a tool. Even affection must have a return. Even friendship must yield something. Even art must be sellable. Even rest must be productive. We start measuring the value of things and our own personal worth using a ruler of efficiency. A conversation is only good if it leads to a solution. A walk is only valid if it counts as exercise. A relationship is only valuable if it makes you a better version of yourself. And slowly, without noticing, we lose the ability to enjoy, because everything must be justified with a goal, a result, a betterment. Pleasure for pleasure becomes a sin. Pausing for the sake of pausing becomes a waste. And the human being is transformed into an endless performance project. This way of thinking creates such a deep distortion that even when we're tired, even when we have no more energy, we still feel obligated to be productive, as if the body is asking for a hug, but the mind says, "Not now, you haven't earned rest yet." And so we create invisible rules, internal targets, silent promises that pile up like burdens. I'll rest only after I finish this. I'll watch a movie only after I answer all the emails. I'll allow myself to relax only if I check off the entire list. The problem isn't having responsibilities. The problem is turning rest into a bargaining chip, only allowing ourselves to exist when we're producing. Rest stops being a right and becomes a conditional permission, one that's rarely granted. The most tragic part is that this utilitarian logic often stems from love. From parents who proudly said, "My child is so hardworking." From teachers who praised those who did more than required. From environments that only acknowledged those who stood out, who performed, who never stopped. Affection was handed out as a reward for usefulness, and that teaches something dangerous, that love must be earned, that it's not enough to simply be, you must deserve it. Deserve it with results, deserve it with productivity, deserve it with excellence. And when we grow up with this kind of conditional love, we carry with us the lifelong feeling that if we're not being useful, we'll be forgotten, that if we stop, we'll disappear. But there is a question that must be asked. Who are you when you're not being useful? Do you still see yourself with kindness? Do you still respect yourself? Do you still allow yourself to exist with dignity? Or do you feel like a burden, a mistake, a failure? When productivity becomes the measure of personal worth, every failure, every pause, every moment of exhaustion turns into shame, and that becomes a prison, because no one can function all the time. Because all of us at some point will need to stop, and what will remain when there is no more output? What will your worth be when you can no longer prove anything? The challenge here isn't to stop being productive, it's to stop identifying solely with it. It's to build a way of existing where usefulness is just one part, not the measure of who you are. You are not a tool. You are not here to perform endlessly. Your worth does not depend on results, deliveries, or achieved goals. There is something within you that remains valuable even when everything is still, even when the day is unproductive, even when you are serving no one. There is a space inside you where love doesn't need to be earned, it simply is. And that space needs to be accessed urgently, because living only to be useful is the shortest path to losing your soul in exchange for applause. Stopping should be simple, but for many people, it's terrifying, because there's a silence that settles in when we finally slow down, and in that silence, questions emerge that we've spent a lifetime avoiding. Who am I without what I produce? What's left of me when I'm not being useful to anyone? Am I still worthy if I'm not delivering anything? These questions hurt because they touch very old wounds, wounds formed in childhood, when we learned that being loved was something to be earned, not something natural. That approval came after effort. That recognition came after results. And so, year after year, we built our identity on performance, productivity, and function, to the point where the idea of simply existing without producing something feels far too frightening. This fear of stopping isn't about lacking rest, it's about lacking an identity beyond usefulness. It's the terror of discovering that without goals, work, or tasks, we feel empty, because we were emotionally trained to define ourselves by what we do. You are what you deliver. You are your performance. You are your resume, your status, your effort. And when those things stop, for a day, a week, or a season of life, everything seems to lose meaning. It's like the ground vanishes. Anxiety sets in, not because there's something urgent to do, but because the body and mind don't know how to inhabit time without rushing. So we invent tasks, we create demands, we keep ourselves busy just to stay busy. Because being busy, even unnecessarily, still feels safer than facing the absence of an identity built on doing. Many adults, in fact, fall into deep existential crises when they lose their jobs, retire, or go through a forced pause, like a medical leave or a sabbatical. Suddenly, what once seemed like just a routine reveals itself as the only pillar of self-worth. And without it, everything collapses. The person starts doubting their own value, begins to feel useless, invisible, even disposable, because their identity was glued to their function, to what they delivered, to their social role. And that's no one's fault. It's the reflection of a culture that applauds performance and ignores essence, that celebrates what you do but rarely asks how you are or who you are when you're doing nothing at all. This emptiness that appears when we stop is in truth an opportunity, a difficult, painful, but deeply necessary invitation to discover who you are beyond the function, to look within and realize that there is value even when you are silent, even when there's nothing to show, even when the world outside keeps spinning and you are standing still. Because inside you there are parts that weren't made to perform. They were made to feel, to exist, to simply be. And those parts, once acknowledged, begin to heal wounds that no amount of productivity ever could. Learning to stop is not a luxury. It's a process of reconnection. It's sitting down with your own soul and asking, what still lives in me when everything around goes quiet? It's deconstructing the idea that you must constantly justify yourself. It's allowing yourself to exist without an immediate purpose, without a visible result, without a concrete achievement, because existence in itself is a miracle, and no one needs to prove they deserve to be here. Your worth is not in what you do. It's in who you are, even when you're doing nothing. And that is the safest place you can ever inhabit. Few things are as dangerous as confusing what you do with who you are, because when that line blurs, every failure becomes an accusation against your essence. Every mistake turns into a verdict on your worth. Every pause feels like a loss. Performance, which should be just one aspect of life, becomes the foundation of identity. And then work is no longer just work. It becomes identity. Productivity is no longer just a habit. It becomes self-esteem. Success is no longer just a goal. It becomes proof that you deserve to exist. And the consequence of this confusion is a life lived under constant pressure, as if every action must secure approval, as if every goal is a chance to finally feel worthy of being alive. This emotional trap doesn't appear out of nowhere. It's built little by little, in homes where love was given based on achievement, where praise came only with good grades, good behavior, good choices. It grows in schools that celebrate the top students, ignore the average, and silence those who learn slowly. It's reinforced by work environments that treat people like numbers, goals, functions. And over time, this pattern becomes internalized. You begin to believe that you only have value if you're being useful, that you only deserve affection if you're being productive, that you can only rest once everything is delivered flawlessly. And this turns you into a slave of your own image, because you must perform, and you must perform well, all the time. The problem is that every performance requires energy, and no one can perform 24 hours a day without breaking. But when identity is tied to performance, there's no room to fail, no room to err, no room to pause. You feel like you can't take off the costume, can't leave the stage, can't show exhaustion, because your worth is tied to your output. This creates a cycle of silent exhaustion, where the soul fades while the body keeps delivering, where the smile is trained, the competence maintained, the appearance preserved, but inside everything is collapsing. And when the inevitable collapse comes, whether through crisis, burnout, deep sadness, or emotional exhaustion, the feeling isn't just of failure, it's of uselessness, of self-loss, of shame for no longer being what you always were, productive. But what no one tells you is that when you stop performing, your true identity finally has space to appear. And in that space lives freedom. The freedom to fail without falling apart. The freedom to rest without guilt. The freedom to change direction without it meaning defeat. When you begin to see that your identity goes far beyond what you deliver, everything inside you starts to rearrange. Goals still exist, effort still matters, but they're no longer tools to prove worth. They become expressions of your journey, not conditions to be loved or seen. Deconstructing this trap is a long process, full of setbacks, but absolutely necessary, because no one was born to be a machine. No one came into this world with the mission to produce non-stop. You are made of layers, silences, imperfections, pauses, bad days. You are not your performance. You are your humanity, and that humanity is valuable, even when it's off stage, even when it isn't being applauded, even when it's just being. Learning this is one of the deepest forms of self-care, Because only when you recognize yourself beyond performance can you truly begin to live. Resting should be a natural gesture. It should be a return to the body, a reconnection with who we are when we're not rushing. But for many people, resting feels like a silent crime, a luxury that must be justified, a break that must be earned in advance, with guilt or with goals fulfilled. And when someone finally tries to stop, lie down, breathe, allow themselves to simply be, with nothing to deliver, the mind begins to attack. You're being useless. There's so much to do, and you're just lying there. You're wasting time. And so, even in rest, the body doesn't relax. The mind stays agitated, guilty, restless, as if pausing were a betrayal of the constant productivity ideal we've learned to worship. That guilt isn't individual. It's socially constructed. From an early age, we're taught to admire those who wake up early, who sleep little, who are always busy. Fatigue became a badge of honor, a packed schedule, a symbol of success, exhaustion, a sign of relevance. And in this cruel logic, rest is seen as weakness, as loss, as falling behind. We start associating free time with failure. We feel threatened when we see someone producing while we're still. We feel ashamed to admit we took a day to do nothing, as if it must be hidden, as if it can only be confessed with a quick, "but I'll make up for it tomorrow right after." The most painful part is that over time, this guilt infiltrates every space of life. It shows up when you try to watch a movie and can't focus because you're thinking about the to-do list, when you take a vacation and feel like you're falling behind, when you have a free Sunday but can't enjoy it because your mind is already on Monday. That guilt contaminates leisure, ruins pleasure, sabotages the present moment, and this creates a chronic feeling that things are never okay, that something is always pending. That rest must be negotiated, not lived. And this kind of guilt is exhausting, because it never truly ends. It just changes shape, changes phrases, changes justifications. But rest is not a mistake. It's a right, a biological, emotional, existential necessity. The body was not made to perform non-stop. The soul was not created to justify itself every second. And the truth is, no one can sustain a healthy life if they're at war with their own rest. Because rest is not the opposite of progress. Rest is part of progress. It's during rest that the body regenerates, the mind reorganizes, the heart catches its breath. It's in the pause that we begin to feel again, to notice, to reconnect. And maybe that's why it scares us, because deep down, we know that rest puts us face to face with what we've been avoiding, including ourselves. Deconstructing the guilt of resting is one of the greatest acts of emotional courage anyone can make. It is choosing every single day to go against a system that says, your value lies in what you deliver. It is learning to say, today I did nothing and I'm still worthy. It's embracing your own existence as something that doesn't need to be justified all the time. And slowly you begin to realize that time is not lost when you rest. It's being returned to you. Because what truly gets lost is a life lived without pause, without presence, without soul. What gets lost is the ability to simply be. There's a kind of addiction that doesn't show up in tests, isn't treated with medication, and is almost never recognized as a problem. It's the addiction to constantly having to prove yourself, the addiction to always surpassing yourself, to always chasing some form of validation, to living as if each day were a new chance to show that you're enough. And the most insidious part is that, at first glance, this addiction looks like willpower. It looks like ambition. It looks like drive. But behind the constant effort, there's a silent desperation from someone who no longer knows how to relax, from someone who feels that if they stop fighting, they lose their right to exist, from someone who confuses worth with performance. Because at some point, this person learned that they are only loved when they impress. The addiction to proving yourself never gives you a break. It turns every situation into a test. Every meeting becomes a chance to shine. Every project becomes a battlefield. Every conversation becomes a stage for comparison. And even when everything goes right, even when recognition arrives, the relief is short-lived. Because the addiction demands bigger doses. It demands new milestones, new praise, new accomplishments. It's like drinking salt water, thinking it will quench your thirst. You achieve, but never feel whole. You succeed, but never feel at peace. Because the problem isn't what you do. It's the feeling that if you're not proving yourself, you disappear. This cycle is fueled by a fragile self-image. Deep down, the person feels they must earn everything all the time, that they have to work for the right to be there, that if they don't constantly show value, they'll be discarded, forgotten, replaced. And even if they say they believe in themselves, the body tells a different story. A body always on alert. Their mind always rehearsing lines, calculating reactions, anticipating criticism. A heart that races at the mere possibility of failure. This addiction to proving oneself is often the emotional shell covering a very old wound. The wound of not feeling enough just for being. And when you live like this, moments of rest become unbearable, because stopping means losing the chance to impress someone. It means losing control of the narrative. It means becoming vulnerable to your own existence. And that vulnerability is frightening, because it exposes what you've spent your whole life trying to hide. The insecurity of simply being without a performance. So even on rest days, the person self-sabotages. They create tasks, invent goals, fill silence with movement, because the noise of productivity helps drown out the fear of not being lovable unless they're shining. But what needs to be said, firmly and gently, is that no one can live like this forever. Because this kind of addiction comes at a high cost. It steals spontaneity, it steals lightness, it steals real connection with others, because deep down, everything turns into competition, comparison, validation. It turns life into a display. And when you're always trying to prove yourself, you're not living, you're performing. But true love, genuine friendship, inner peace, none of those things are born from performance. They come from emotional rest, from the space where you allow yourself to be imperfect, vulnerable, and still worthy of love. Breaking free from this addiction doesn't mean giving up on excellence. It means stopping the belief that your worth depends on it. It means building a space within yourself where you don't have to be brilliant to be accepted, where you can simply be, and that is already enough, where you can rest without fear of disappearing, because your worth is not in what you prove. It's in who you already are, even in silence, even in pause, even on the days when you're not trying to be anything more than human. We live immersed in a culture that constantly whispers, "You're not enough." You wake up, and there's already something you should be doing better. You reach a goal and you're immediately pushed toward the next one. You deliver a result, and in the very same moment someone asks, "What's next?" This logic of infinite productivity drives us into a race with no finish line. Because no matter how hard you try, there's always a new level of demand ahead. There's always someone producing more, being more efficient, appearing more successful. And in this environment, saturated with goals, metrics, and invisible rankings, the only way to exist seems to be in permanent acceleration mode, as if rest were a threat, as if pausing meant failure. This culture is seductive because it disguises itself as personal development, ambition, growth. It tells you you can do anything, but hides the emotional cost. It preaches resilience, but ignores exhaustion. It celebrates those who never stop, but silences those who break down. And little by little, you're trained to believe that being good isn't enough. You have to be the best. That doing something well isn't enough. You have to do it faster. That being efficient isn't enough. You have to be tireless. And in that process, your humanity is discarded and replaced by outcomes. You stop being a whole person and become a gear trying not to break. The cruelest part is that this logic respects no boundaries. It invades even the most intimate spaces. It turns leisure into a networking opportunity. It turns meditation into a brain optimization technique. It turns home time into a chance to get ahead on tasks. Life becomes a project in which everything must yield some return. And when something doesn't, it's deemed useless. That includes people, emotions, hard phases, moments of stillness. Anything that doesn't produce is dismissed. And from that, a generation is born. Highly productive but profoundly drained. People who deliver everything, except peace. Who achieve so much, but can't breathe. Who are applauded, but no longer recognize themselves. This culture is a system, and like every system, it is upheld by collective behavior. Every time someone feels guilty for resting, every time someone feels behind for seeing others produce more, every time someone silences their pain to not disrupt performance, this system grows stronger. And it only begins to crack when we have the courage to resist. When we say, "I'm not a machine," when we recognize that life cannot be measured solely by achieved goals, when we begin to remember that dignity isn't earned through performance. Dignity is an innate right. You have value before any delivery. Dismantling this culture doesn't mean abandoning your dreams, your effort, or your discipline. It means letting go of the belief that you must always be producing in order to deserve to exist. It means making peace with the idea that there's beauty in doing less. There is wisdom in pausing. There is courage in not following the rush. Because doing more, being more, and delivering more is only worthwhile if it doesn't cost your mental health, your presence, your soul. And the truth is, the world doesn't need more exhausted people pretending to be okay. The world needs whole people. And being whole sometimes begins with the simple and revolutionary act of stopping. We've never been so surrounded by mirrors, digital mirrors lit by screens, where thousands of lives display themselves constantly, always in motion, always producing, always achieving something. And even though we know it's all cropped, filtered, and edited, our brain registers it as emotional truth. The mind compares even when the heart knows it's unfair. And so with every scroll, we sink a little deeper into the feeling of being behind in our careers, our goals, our bodies, our productivity. Because while you try to rest, someone is posting a reading marathon, a new project, a life transformation. While you try to sleep, someone is taking advantage of the night to get things done. And the silent message that sets in is cruel. You're not doing enough. Social media isn't the problem in itself. The problem is what it starts to represent emotionally for people already fragile under the weight of performance. The timeline becomes a field of comparison, and rest becomes a burden. Because while you pause, the virtual world screams motion. Other people's lives become metrics for your own. Other people's feeds become the ruler for your self-worth. And little by little, the desire to feel at peace is replaced by the need to appear functional. You're not resting. You're producing content while relaxing. You're not living the moment. You're capturing, editing, and sharing it. Because even rest has to generate engagement. Even silence needs a pretty caption. Even vulnerability has to perform. This phenomenon creates a new layer of anxiety, the anxiety of not appearing. The feeling that if you don't show it, it's as if it didn't happen. If you didn't post it, you didn't do it. If you didn't produce, you don't exist. It silently erodes the real experience of life, because being present requires the absence of performance. And social media, as much as it connects us, often pushes us into this constant role of presentation. We stop fully feeling in order to capture better. We stop living to present. We stop existing to be consumed. And in the process, we disconnect from ourselves. Many people who are already emotionally overwhelmed find in social media a distorted mirror of their own failure, because everything there looks more beautiful, more productive, more meaningful. And we forget that no one posts the crying spell in the middle of the afternoon. No one shows the Sunday when they couldn't get out of bed. No one records the moments of anxiety, doubt, or stagnation. We only see what was chosen to be seen. We only see the bright side of other people's lives. And when we compare that to the fullness of our own, the feeling of inadequacy explodes. What was supposed to be a distraction becomes a demand. What was supposed to be connection becomes competition. What was supposed to be entertainment becomes a daily reminder that you're still not there. The answer isn't to isolate yourself from the world, nor to pretend social media doesn't exist. The answer is remembering that rest doesn't need to be posted to be legitimate, that worth doesn't need to be shown to exist, that your pace doesn't need to match any feed. You can be in silence and still be at peace. You can be in pause and still be transforming. You can go unseen and still be blooming. Because what truly matters in your life will not become a story. It will become presence, health, and a light soul, and no filter can capture that. Even before we understand what love truly is, we are already being taught, not with words but through gestures, that this feeling may depend on our behavior. Some children grow up hearing praise only when they get good grades. Others only receive affection when they obey perfectly. There are those who are called special only when they're praised by adults, when they stand out, when they help, when they don't cause trouble. And so, without anyone saying it explicitly, a painful and silent belief begins to take shape. I'm loved when I do everything right. Childhood, which should be a territory of unconditional acceptance, becomes an arena where the child learns to perform in order not to be rejected, to earn affection, to avoid abandonment. That child, still so small, internalizes the idea that love is a reward, not a right. They learn that their presence is only welcome if it comes with usefulness, with kindness, with good performance. And then they begin to observe everything carefully. The reactions of their parents, the looks from adults, the comparisons with siblings, with classmates. Every gesture becomes a test. Every word becomes a sign of approval or rejection. And slowly, without realizing it, they begin to mold their identity around other people's expectations. They abandon spontaneity, suppress emotions, silence desires, all to keep being the child that makes people proud. Because in that emotional universe, being loved depends on being flawless. The problem is that this logic doesn't fade with time. It just disguises itself in adulthood. That child who learned that love must be earned becomes the adult who can't rest without guilt, the professional who feels like a failure even when competent, the partner who lives in fear of disappointing, the friend who's always trying to prove their worth. This adult might say they love themselves, but deep inside carries the wound of someone who never felt loved simply for existing. And that's why they're always chasing excellence, because they learned that making mistakes is dangerous, that failing can drive people away, that stopping might make them invisible. It takes a lot of courage to look back at that emotional childhood, because often the parents did the best they could. Often no one meant to cause harm. But pain doesn't need blame to exist. It just needs to be seen, recognized, named. When you realize that you grew up trying to earn love, the process of healing begins, not to blame anyone, but to free yourself from a pattern that still holds you captive. Because as long as you keep trying to be flawless to feel worthy, you will keep living in fear. Fear of failure, fear of stopping, fear of not pleasing. And that fear consumes the soul, even when everything seems to be going right on the outside. Healing begins when you understand that true love doesn't have to be earned, that your worth is not in what you do, but in who you are, even in your imperfections. It begins when you look at yourself with tenderness and say, I don't have to outperform myself all the time to deserve affection. It begins when you learn to rest without guilt, because you start to believe that your existence is enough. It begins when you embrace yourself, even on the days when you did nothing useful, because it is in that space, between self-love and the healing of a wounded childhood, that the freedom to simply be begins to live. It starts slowly, in disguise, sometimes with a small gesture, an innocent comment, a mindless scroll through your timeline. You see someone celebrating an achievement and your stomach tightens. Someone changes jobs, buys a car, publishes a book, loses weight, travels, gets married, does something, and that's it. Even if you don't want to, something inside you twists. You even try to be happy for them, but that invisible thought sneaks in. I should be doing more. And from there, comparison settles in. Not as declared envy, but as a quiet noise, a persistent discomfort, a constant sense of being behind, of failing, of being less. And even when you're doing fine, it convinces you that you could be doing better, that you should be faster, more productive, more attractive, more confident, more efficient, more everything. Comparison is a silent poison because it disguises itself as a reference, as a benchmark, even as inspiration, but it doesn't inspire. It drains. It drains the joy from small achievements, drains the self-esteem you work so hard to build, drains the value of your own path. Because when you compare yourself, you're no longer in you, you're in the other, and the other becomes the standard, the goal, the threat. You stop seeing what you already have, what you've already built, what you've already overcome. Comparison distorts. It makes you believe your journey doesn't count, that your victory was small, that your pain is an exaggeration. And with that, you begin to invalidate yourself, to push yourself harder, to demand more, even in the moments when you should be at peace. The cruelest part is that comparison isn't just with strangers. Sometimes it's with friends, with colleagues, with siblings, with an idealized version of your past self, or with an impossible projection of who you should be by now. At that level, comparison stops being an external measure and becomes an internal prison, because nothing is ever enough. Everything needs to be proven. Anxiety grows, productivity becomes obsession, and even rest starts to feel wrong, because someone, somewhere, is producing while you breathe, is achieving while you pause, is advancing while you simply are. But the truth that needs to be said and repeated is that there's no such thing as being behind when you're being faithful to your own time. Life is not a race. Existence is not a ranking. There's no metric to measure the worth of a soul. And every person carries a whole world inside, with stories, pain, trauma, and circumstances no one sees. When you compare, you ignore all of that. You take someone else's result and erase your own process. You hurt yourself over an ideal that isn't even yours, and that's cruel. To you, to your story, to your truth. Breaking free from comparison takes courage. The courage to look at yourself with compassion, to respect your own cycles, to quiet the outside noise so you can hear your own voice, to allow yourself to be you, even when the world offers you 1,000 better versions, because you didn't come here to be someone else, you came to be whole in yourself. And that includes flaws, pauses, doubts, slowness. It includes days of achievement and days of exhaustion, moments of clarity and phases of silence. Comparison wants to convince you that you're only worthy if you're winning. But the deeper truth is, you are already whole, even if you're still becoming. Something got lost along the way when we started turning even pleasure into a task, when hobbies became disguised productivity and rest turned into a performance strategy. Suddenly, reading a book for pleasure feels like wasted time if it doesn't produce a post, a useful insight, or a new skill. Watching a movie is no longer entertainment. It becomes inspiration. Traveling only makes sense if there are enough photos, enough stories, enough engagement. Even the weekend, which should be a space for pause, has become just another window to do something that justifies your existence. The logic is clear, even if unspoken. If it doesn't produce anything, it's not worth it. This phenomenon isn't individual. It's a reflection of a culture that has monetized everything. That turned even leisure into capital. Capital of attention, of image, of content. And when the mind adapts to this logic, spontaneous pleasure disappears. You can no longer watch a series without thinking about what insight you'll extract. You can't go for a walk without turning it into a step-counting goal. You can't play around without feeling like you're wasting time. And so, leisure becomes just another form of justification, just another performance, just another gear in the machine of productivity disguised as freedom. This emotional distortion hits hardest in those already fragile from the need to prove themselves, because genuine leisure requires presence, and presence requires inner security. It requires the confidence that you don't have to be delivering something at all times to be worthy of love, respect, or belonging. It takes courage to simply exist without doing, to enjoy without explaining, to allow yourself without turning everything into a tool for personal development. But when you grow up believing your worth depends on your output, pure leisure feels like a mistake, like waste, like a luxury. And so you fill your free time with micro-tasks that make you appear functional, even in the moments when you should just be resting. What's most dangerous is that this kind of productive leisure seems healthy at first glance. After all, you're doing something good, right? Cooking, reading, practicing yoga, traveling. But the problem isn't the activity, it's the intention behind it. If every action carries the need to justify your existence, then pleasure stops being nourishment and becomes currency. You're not having fun, you're briefly soothing the guilt of not being useful. You're not relaxing, you're fulfilling a social function within the narrative of efficiency. And in the long run, that becomes harmful, because the body remains on high alert, and the soul never truly finds rest. We need to reclaim the right to do things just because. To listen to music without needing to gain anything from it. To look at the sky for minutes on end without turning it into a photo. To draw poorly, dance off beat, laugh for no reason. Because it's in those moments that we reconnect with forgotten parts of ourselves. Parts that weren't made to produce but to feel. That weren't made to impress but to live. Leisure is sacred, and it's only real when it stops serving a function and starts feeding your soul. You don't need to turn everything into a project. Not every minute needs to be optimized. Time wasn't made just to produce. It was also made to hold, to breathe, to wonder. Allowing yourself guilt-free leisure is an act of resistance. A quiet scream that says, I exist even when I'm not delivering anything. And in today's world, that's already a revolution. There's a kind of anxiety that doesn't show up as an explosive crisis, but as a constant noise, an engine that never shuts off. It's the anxiety of someone who doesn't know how to simply to be, of someone who feels the need to justify their presence in every place, every moment, every silence, as if breathing by itself weren't enough, as if being alive demanded at all times some kind of delivery, some result, some explanation. This person wakes up thinking about what they need to do to earn their day, goes to bed with the feeling they didn't do enough. And even in the rare moments when there are no urgent demands, they feel guilty, because their mind has learned to feed on tasks, and the emptiness of a pause feels like a threat. This anxiety of doing is silent, but brutal. It prevents the body from resting and the soul from relaxing. It turns everything into urgency. It strips the joy from the present, because the present is always seen as a step before something else, a transition, an interval between two tasks. Nothing is an end in itself. Everything must point to a what's next, and at that pace life passes without presence. You live anticipating, you live explaining, you live defending yourself from a pressure that often doesn't even come from others. It comes from within, from that part of you that learned you only have the right to exist when you're producing, when you're being useful, when you're proving you're not a burden. Many people think this anxiety is just too much responsibility, but it's actually an identity wound, a confusion between being and doing, between worth and output, between presence and function. And this confusion begins in emotional histories where love was conditional, where affection was given based on performance, where silence was mistaken for laziness, where the child only felt seen when helping, serving, fixing. Adulthood then becomes an extension of that, and the anxiety of doing takes root as a survival mechanism, as if stopping meant disappearing, as if the emptiness of doing nothing would expose an internal emptiness, one that never really existed, but was taught as truth. This anxiety isn't healed with more productivity. On the contrary, it's healed through confrontation, facing the discomfort of doing nothing, facing silence without needing to fill it, facing the idea that you can still be worthy on an unproductive day, facing the fear of being seen without being efficient. Because only then does the body learn that it doesn't have to function all the time to exist, and the soul learns it doesn't need to justify its own light, that living is not a test to pass, that breathing is already an act of worth. You don't need to explain yourself. You don't need to constantly present yourself as someone who's doing well. You don't need to perform to be accepted. There is a way of existing, deeply freeing, where you can simply be. Where doing comes from desire, not from pressure. Where action is born from presence, not from anxiety. And when you reach that place, time shifts. The body thanks you. The mind slows down, and the heart, finally, can beat in peace. There is a silent kind of pain that strikes exactly those who did everything right, those who followed the rules, met the goals, earned degrees, landed promotions, built stability. People who did everything the logic of performance demanded, and still carry a deep emptiness, a nameless discomfort, a sadness that's hard to explain. Because in theory, everything should be fine. It should be gratitude. It should be pride. But inside, something doesn't fit, as if after so much effort the trophy is hollow, as if the victory tastes like nothing, and no one understands, not even the one who feels it, because the mind says, "You made it." But the heart replies, "Now what?" This emptiness shows up when life is built solely around results, when every step is guided by, "What will this bring me?" when every choice is made with utility, security, and efficiency in mind. And what gets left out in the process is the soul, the genuine desire, the spontaneous joy, the feeling swallowed by the doing. The person looks around and sees everything in place: job, house, routine, recognition. But inside, there's no meaning. Because somewhere along the way they got lost, forgot why they started, forgot what they loved, forgot themselves. And this forgetting isn't guilt. It's the consequence of a system that trains us to perform, not to live. The pain of having everything and still not feeling whole is one of the hardest to admit, because it looks like ingratitude, like weakness, like drama. So many people have less. You should be happy. Stop complaining. But this pain is real, and it needs to be heard, because it's a sign that something essential was left behind, that maybe you lived too much for others, for your resume, for recognition, and forgot to live for yourself. That maybe your life is full of completed tasks, but empty of soul, and no amount of achievements can fill that absence. It's at this point that many face an existential crisis, and the crisis is not the end. It's the beginning. It's the invitation to reorganize, to reconnect, to remember that a meaningful life isn't built only with achievements, it's built with presence, with pleasure, with real connections, with moments that serve no purpose other than making you feel alive. Maybe it's time to ask, what truly makes me feel alive? What would I still do even if no one was watching? What gives me the feeling of truly being here? Because these are the questions that bring back your essence, that return you to yourself, that remind you you're not just your performance. You are your entire existence with all your emptiness, silences, doubts, and pauses. Hitting goals can be good. Achieving things is valid. But no goal is worth the price of losing yourself in the process. No external applause compensates for the internal silence of someone who no longer recognizes themselves. Living isn't just about getting places. It's about being whole with every step. It's about having the courage to slow down, to look inward, to admit that what might be missing isn't another achievement. It's more of you, more presence, more truth, more soul. There is a kind of silence that scares, that feels empty, that brings a discomfort hard to name. It's the silence that arrives when the noise of productivity fades, when the phone is put aside, the notifications stop, the deadlines are postponed, and then, with no noise, no tasks, no rush, silence shows up, and along with it, a flood of emotions that were buried under layers of urgent anxiety, sadness, boredom, emptiness, fear. This uncomfortable silence that so many avoid is the very place where truth lives, because without distractions, you begin to hear yourself. And listening to yourself can be the most revolutionary and the hardest thing to do in a world that trains you to ignore what you feel. The truth is, we learn to fear silence, because in it, there is no performance, no applause, no justification. There is only presence, only you with all that you carry, with everything you avoided feeling, with everything that still needs to be named. And that's terrifying, because silence confronts you with the questions you've been pushing away. Who am I without what I do? What hurts me that I've never faced? What am I really afraid of? And in those pauses, where no one demands anything, where there are no goals, no spotlight, you begin to discover who you really are, truly. Not who you pretend to be, not who you try to impress, but who you are when no one is watching. It's in this silence that the soul reorganizes itself, because far from the noise, you can finally feel what your body has been trying to say for so long, the accumulated fatigue, the longing for yourself, the need to breathe deeper, the hunger for presence. And when you allow silence to stay, instead of fleeing from it, it starts to become less of a threat. It starts becoming a shelter, a space of healing, a place where emotions are allowed to exist without being labeled unproductive. Silence becomes a reunion with your essence, with the dreams you suppressed, with the pain you ignored, with the desires you postponed. What's curious is that over time, this silence stops hurting, because you learn to inhabit your own time without feeling behind. You learn to be alone without feeling inadequate. You learn that you don't have to be producing all the time to be someone, that the value of your life is not in the number of tasks, but in the quality of your connection with yourself, that the world can keep spinning out there, but you don't have to spin with it all the time. You can pause, breathe, stay, and still be worthy. Silence then becomes practice, becomes a choice, becomes rest. It is in silence that you discover you don't need much to be well, that you can live with less noise, less pressure, less fear, and more presence, more truth, more lightness, because silence, contrary to what you've been told, is not absence. It is space for something new to bloom. And maybe what needs to bloom now is exactly this, the courage to exist without needing to justify yourself, the courage to stop, the courage to finally hear what your soul has been trying to say for a very, very long time. There is a kind of freedom that isn't found in great achievements, in applause or in goals reached. It lives in the simplicity of waking up and feeling at peace, even with nothing impressive to show, in taking a deep breath and not blaming yourself for standing still, in being with someone and not feeling the need to justify your presence. This freedom is born the moment you realize you no longer need to explain who you are, nor prove it, nor defend it. That your existence by itself already has value. That just being here whole with your story, your silences, your pauses is already enough. That you can simply be. But getting to this place means crossing through layer after layer of emotional conditioning, because we were taught to perform from a young age, to get good grades, to be helpful at home, to please adults, to earn affection through effort. Childhood was marked by looks that praised when we succeeded, and turned silent when we simply existed. And over time, that logic became internalized. Life turned into a stage. Each scene brought a new obligation. Every act demanded a new version of ourselves to fit expectations, and just being without explaining seemed impossible, because being at peace without producing something felt like laziness, like selfishness, like failure. But it's not. There's no failure in being. There's no guilt in existing. You don't have to be on a mission all the time. You don't need to turn every gesture into something profitable, productive, or useful. There is value in rest, in idleness, in silence, in a day where you simply lived, without rush, without stage, without performance. And it's in that space that the soul finds its breath, because it wasn't made to prove anything. It was made to feel, to live genuinely, even if it impresses no one, even if it doesn't get likes, promotions, or praise. Because what is true isn't always grand, but it is always enough. The beauty of existing without the need to explain or deliver lies in rediscovering yourself as presence, not as function. It lies in understanding that your worth is non-negotiable, that it needs no translation, no edit, no external validation. It's in looking at yourself with tenderness and saying, "Today I did nothing special, but I existed, and that's enough." Because there's something deeply sacred in existing with lightness, in not carrying the weight of expectation, in not turning every gesture into a performance, in just being in peace with yourself. And if someone asks, "What did you do today?" you can calmly answer, I was presence, I was affection, I was breath, I was whole, even without a plan, even without a goal, even without an explanation, because in the end, that's what life is made of existences that don't need to justify themselves, of souls that allow themselves to be, of people who finally understand that love isn't earned through performance. It blooms in the freedom to be who you are, in silence, in peace. Most of us learned, without even realizing it, that rest is something you earn, that you can only stop after doing a lot, that you can only take a deep breath once everything is resolved, delivered, and flawless. Rest, then, becomes a reward, not a right. It turns into a prize for productivity, a permission granted only when you can no longer go on. And even then, when it finally comes, it's a rest tainted by guilt, because the mind is still racing, because the to-do list never ends, because the body stops, but the conscience keeps whispering, you could be doing more. And in this cycle, rest fails to serve its purpose. It doesn't regenerate. It merely tries to save you from collapse. But rest is not a luxury. It's not a privilege. It's not something you get after proving yourself worthy. Rest is biological, emotional, existential. It's as essential as food, as necessary as sleep, as vital as touch. And when it's denied or conditioned, something inside us begins to break, because the body knows it needs to stop. The soul longs for pause, but the mind, wired by a culture of exhaustion, insists on continuing, insists on saying that stopping is losing, that relaxing is weakness, that breathing slowly is a waste of time. And that voice, repeated over a lifetime, convinces us that we can only rest when nothing is pending. But that moment never comes, because there will always be something. Breaking this logic is an act of rebellion. It's declaring that you are not a cog in a machine, that your existence is not for sale, that your health is worth more than any goal, and it is also an act of self-respect. Because when you allow yourself to rest before reaching your limit, you're telling yourself, I matter even when I'm not producing. You're saying that well-being doesn't come after exhaustion, it comes before it. You're saying that your pause is sacred and not negotiable, that it doesn't need justification, that it doesn't have to produce anything but you, with yourself, in silence, breathing, being. When rest is seen as a reward, it becomes scarce. Because the bar of deserving is always moving. You never feel you've done enough. You always think you could have done more. And so you postpone the break. You stretch the limit. You ignore the signs until the body screams, until the mind shuts down, until the soul gives up. And when that happens, rest is no longer a choice, and it's an emergency, a cry for help, a last resort. But it should never come to that. It should be routine, rhythm, part of life's natural cycle. Just as day demands night, effort demands rest, and no victory is worth a permanently exhausted soul. You don't need to wait until you're at the edge to allow yourself to stop. You can rest today, right now, even if the house is messy, even if your inbox is overflowing, even if deadlines are looming, because your worth does not depend on how much you can endure before pausing. Your worth lies in your existence, and to exist fully requires rest, requires breath, requires the right to do nothing without guilt. And when that right is respected, life changes. Productivity stops being an obligation and becomes a choice. The body stops being a machine and returns to being a home. And the soul finally finds space to bloom with lightness. The body speaks, even when the mind pretends not to hear. It speaks through pain that doesn't go away, through tension that builds up, through sleep that never feels like enough. It screams through anxiety attacks, recurring migraines, emotional gastritis, and unexplained exhaustion. And often, what's falling ill isn't the body itself. It's the soul that was never allowed to rest. It's the heart that lives on high alert. It's the mind that never feels at home. It's the spirit overwhelmed by a lifetime of self-demand, pressure, and fear of disappointing. And when this soul lives in constant conflict with its own humanity, the body pays the price, because it's the last stronghold, the final way we're able to recognize that something is wrong. Behind many physical diagnoses, there are emotional stories left unresolved. There are wounds swallowed with a smile. There are boundaries crossed in the name of productivity. There are sleepless nights driven by fear of not delivering enough. There are performances of strength that came at a high cost, because the body can endure, up to a point, but it has limits. And when we surpass those limits for too long, it resorts to the one language that cannot be ignored: illness. Not as punishment, but as a message, as a plea, as a desperate request for care, for pause, for listening. Many of us were taught to ignore the signs of the body, to treat pain as a minor detail, to overcome fatigue with willpower, to silence exhaustion with coffee, pills, and routine. And that might work, for a while. But eventually, the body collects, because it remembers. It stores everything. It doesn't forget the nights it wasn't allowed to rest, the "I'm fines" spoken while you were falling apart inside, the times you forced yourself to go on when every part of you was begging to stop. And when that bill comes due, treating the symptoms won't be enough. You must face the cause, and the cause almost always lives in the soul that was never given permission to breathe. This disconnect between body and soul is not just a personal issue, it's cultural. We live in a society that values doing and dismisses feeling, that celebrates those who never stop, that romanticizes burnout, that teaches us asking for help is weakness, saying no is selfish, and slowing down is failure. And in this environment, illness becomes a form of resistance, a cry that something is deeply wrong, that we're trying to live like machines, but we're made of flesh, of emotion, of sensitivity, and when the soul is ignored, it makes the body sick just to be heard. Healing the body, then, takes more than medication. It requires listening to your own pain, your own pace, your own desire. It takes courage to change the rhythm, to say enough, to start over in a new tempo. It requires recognizing that your health is worth more than any goal, that your well-being is more valuable than any praise, that your life cannot be lived as an endless project of output, because you're not here to produce, you're here to live. And truly living includes stopping, includes caring, includes listening to the body before it has to scream. Give yourself permission, before the pain has to stop you by force, before exhaustion becomes illness, before the soul, ignored for so long, has to express itself through symptoms that medicine can't explain, but the heart understands. Because rest is not a luxury, it's survival, it's resistance, it's the most radical act of someone who chooses to love themselves before it's too late. There is a pain that doesn't bleed, that doesn't show up in medical exams but leaves deep marks. The pain of never feeling enough, the constant sense that something is missing, that you're not good enough, interesting enough, productive enough, that no matter how much you do, how much you try, there's always one more step, one more proof, one more validation needed. It's like carrying an invisible ruler at all times, measuring every action, every flaw, every success, and always finding a fault, always feeling like you're falling short. This sensation might seem normal, but it's a form of chronic suffering. And more than that, it's a poison that erodes self-esteem, destroys spontaneity, and traps the human being in a constant effort to justify their existence. This difficulty in feeling enough starts early. In homes where compliments came with a, "but you could have done more." In environments where love was conditioned on performance. In comparisons made by those who were supposed to protect. In glances that said, "You disappointed me," even when you were just trying to be yourself. Over time, the child learns being is not enough, you must impress. Loving isn't enough, you must earn it. And this belief, planted in childhood, grows and blooms in adulthood as anxiety, perfectionism, toxic relationships, and self-abandonment. Because deep down, the person believes they are never worthy of their own existence. The problem is that this type of thinking doesn't go away with achievements. You can reach all your dreams and still feel empty. You can receive compliments and not believe them. You can be loved and still doubt it. Because the emptiness isn't from what's lacking outside, it's from the wound left inside. A wound that whispers, "You're not enough as you are." And as long as that voice is the loudest, no accomplishment will taste sweet. No affection will be enough. No rest will feel deserved. You'll keep running, striving, proving, trying, and losing yourself in the process. But what if little by little you stopped running? What if you began treating yourself as someone who is already whole, even when you stumble? What if you started looking at yourself through the eyes of unconditional love, not critical evaluation? Because sufficiency isn't about perfection. It's about being real, being honest with yourself, allowing yourself to feel, to pause, to fail, to learn. It's about realizing that the value of your life isn't measured by what you produce, but by how fully you allow yourself to exist. It's about understanding that true love, the kind that heals and frees, doesn't have to be earned. It just needs to be received. Accepting that we are already enough is a process. It doesn't happen overnight, but it begins with one simple and profound act: stopping the attack. Stop criticizing every detail. Stop comparing yourself to everyone. Stop demanding a standard that no one upholds all the time. And it also begins with another, even more transformative act: self-acceptance. Allowing yourself to rest. Allowing yourself to feel proud even when no one is watching. To say to yourself with firmness and tenderness, "I am already enough." Even on days when I do nothing. Even on days when I feel lost. Even on days when I feel weak. You were not born to justify yourself. You were born to be. And being, with all that entails, light and shadow, strength and vulnerability, is already enough. There is a kind of self-esteem that collapses at the slightest sign of failure, that disappears when results don't come, that withers in the face of criticism, mistakes, or the unexpected. This kind of self-esteem is fragile because it was built on an unstable foundation: performance. It depends on high grades, hit targets, sculpted bodies, and showcased achievements. It survives on external applause and lives in a state of constant alert, afraid that without performance nothing will remain. But true self-esteem cannot depend on what you do. It must be rooted in who you are. Because if your worth only exists when you're delivering something, you'll never feel at peace. You'll live exhausted, insecure, a slave to results that don't define your essence. Reclaiming true self-esteem begins with deconstruction, with the courage to separate your identity from your function, with the radical act of looking at yourself on unproductive days and still recognizing yourself with love, of looking at yourself on days you failed, made mistakes, or froze, and still not punishing yourself. This isn't complacency, it's liberation, because self-esteem that only survives on good days isn't real self-esteem. It's disguised vanity. It's emotional survival. It's a constant effort to avoid collapse. And that's not living. That's enduring. And enduring all the time wears you down, makes you sick, and empties you. The healing begins when you stop treating yourself like a project, When you stop looking at yourself with the eyes of an evaluator and start seeing yourself with compassion, it starts when you accept that you will fail, and that doesn't change who you are, that you will disappoint someone, and that doesn't destroy your value, that there will be days of confusion, of silence, of absence, and that's part of being human. You are not your performance. You are not your productivity. You are much more than what you're able to deliver, and when that truth takes root, everything changes. Because it builds emotional stability. You begin to allow yourself to grow without punishment, to evolve without comparison, to rest without guilt. True self-esteem is also built through small choices. Choosing not to attack yourself when you fall short, choosing to speak to yourself with kindness, choosing to treat yourself the way you would treat someone you love, choosing to forgive yourself, to understand yourself, to respect yourself. Each act of self-compassion is a brick in the construction of solid self-worth, a self-esteem that remains even when the world doesn't clap, even when the algorithm doesn't deliver, even when results don't show up, because it doesn't depend on those things. It is born from your connection with yourself, from recognizing that you are simply worthy, worthy of being here, worthy of love, worthy of living with ease. The day you truly understand that, something inside you shifts. You stop constantly running. You stop trying to prove yourself. You stop trying to fill the void with productivity, and you begin to inhabit your own life with presence, with wholeness, with a peace that doesn't rely on achievements, because you no longer need to earn your worth. It is already yours. It always was. There comes a point when the soul can no longer take it. When the body starts to scream, the mind collapses, and life loses its color, even though it's filled with achievements, because no one was made to live in constant production mode. No one was born to function, perform, deliver, and justify their existence every day as if they were on an assembly line. And yet, that's exactly what we were taught. We were emotionally programmed to believe we only have value when we're useful, that we only deserve love, rest, and recognition when we're doing something visible, something measurable, something impressive. But that is a lie that makes us sick, that exhausts us, that dehumanizes us, because you are not a machine, you are a human being. And being human includes failing, stopping, doubting, feeling, and above all, simply being. The deepest form of freedom someone can achieve is the ability to exist without constantly justifying themselves. It's waking up on an unproductive day and not feeling guilty. It's resting without apologizing. It's taking a deep breath without the need to turn it into a task. This kind of freedom is revolutionary because it goes against everything we were taught, against the culture of rush, of toxic productivity, of destructive self-demand. It invites us into a different rhythm, a gentler internal tempo, a more compassionate gaze, and above all, it reminds us that a person's worth should never depend on their utility. You don't need to be in constant motion to have value. You don't need to outdo yourself every day to deserve respect. You already are. This reclaiming isn't romantic, it's urgent, because an entire generation is falling ill under the weight of seeming strong, of appearing functional, of looking enough. And that constant performance comes at a steep price. It steals sleep, joy, spontaneity. It disconnects you from your body, disconnects you from your soul, weakens your bonds. And when everything collapses, the deepest pain isn't from exhaustion. It's from the absence of self. It's realizing you spent years chasing an unreachable ideal while forgetting to care for yourself, to listen to yourself, to simply allow yourself to live. And at that point, healing begins exactly where it all seemed to end, in stopping, in yielding, in letting go of being a machine. Yes, you can stop, you can slow down, you can choose not to produce today, you can go a whole week without achieving anything new, and still you are valuable, because your existence doesn't need to be defended with metrics, your soul doesn't need to perform to be worthy of love, and your time doesn't need to be optimized, it needs to be lived. Lived with presence, with truth, with space for what is light, for what serves no purpose, for all that is simply being. And in this world that demands so much from you, just being is already courage, it is already resistance, it is already beauty. So may you remember this every time the pressure tightens, every time guilt creeps in, every time the anxiety of doing tries to take over. Remember, you are not a cog in the machine. You are an entire universe, a body that feels, a mind that thinks, A soul that pulses, and all of that exists even when you're not producing anything. And for that alone, it is enough. You are, and to be is enough.